Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a massive step back from the usual debates you hear in this space.
Yeah, we're not talking about rock layers or fossils today.
Exactly. You know, all the arguments about geology, starlight, that kind of thing. We're engaging with a stack of material that basically calls all of that secondary.
Which is a pretty bold claim, right? I mean, considering how heated those scientific debates can get.
Right. But the source material we're analyzing today, it's mainly a chapter by Dr. David Ketchpool and Dr. Mark Harwood, plus some interview transcripts. It argues that the real Achilles heel of evolutionary theory isn't biological at all.
It's moral.
It's moral. It's a shift from, how did we get here to because we are here, how should we behave?
And the whole premise of this deep dive really is that you just can't separate those two questions.
The authors are essentially arguing that a society's view of its origin, where we all come from, is the primary driver of its ethics.
It's the old ideas have consequences argument, but really cranked up to 11. And they use this visual analogy to frame the whole thing. They call it the two trees. Okay, the two trees. It's a simple image, but it does a lot of heavy lifting for their argument.
Let's unpack that a bit then before we get into all the, the heavy historical stuff. How do they form this up?
So on one side, you have what they call the creation tree, or the theistic tree. The roots here are planted firmly in the Bible, specifically in Genesis.
Okay.
And the argument is, if the roots are God created, then the fruit, the natural outcome, is a system of moral absolutes.
So things are right or wrong no matter what we think about them. Is that the idea?
Exactly. Accountability. The idea that life is sacred, that humans have this intrinsic value because they're made in the image of a creator, that's the fruit of that tree.
Okay. So what's the other tree?
That's the evolutionary or naturalistic tree. So the roots here are a rejection of the supernatural. The idea that we're just the product of time, chance, natural processes.
And the fruit of that tree is?
According to the source text, it's moral relativism.
Relativism is one of those words, it gets thrown around a lot. How are they defining it here?
They're defining it as the loss of any objective standard. If there's no authority higher than humanity, then right and wrong just become, well, a matter of opinion.
A consensus vote, maybe? Not a universal law?
Exactly. It's just a vote. And this is where the authors pose a question that is, I think it's meant to be really provocative.
Okay.
They ask, if we are just, and I'm quoting the text here, rearranged pawn scum, or the result of a giant cosmic accident, is there any hard logical reason to say that murder is objectively wrong?
That's a harsh way to put it.
It is, but philosophically it's a valid question.
Yeah.
If you strip away the metaphysical, all you're left with is the material. And, matter doesn't have ethics, atoms don't have morality.
They use the tragedy of 9/11 to illustrate this clash of opinions.
They do. They point out that from a purely materialist view, you had one group of men who genuinely believed crashing planes into buildings was a righteous act, a moral good.
While the rest of the world saw it as a horrific evil.
But without an external referee, without a god, how do you even adjudicate that?
That's the author's point, I guess.
Right. Without a standard that's above human opinion, you can't actually say the terrorists were wrong in an absolute sense. You can only say you disagree with them or that their actions weren't useful for society. But you can't call it evil in that gut-level way we all want to.
This brings us to William B. Provine. The source quotes him quite a bit. He was a professor of evolutionary biology at Cornell, so he's not some fringe figure.
Not at all. And Provine was known for being, I think, intellectually honest about the implications of his atheism. He didn't sugarcoat it.
So what's the quote?
The one in the text says that if modern evolutionary biology is true, then there are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind.
He goes further than that, though. He brings up free will.
No free will. That's the kicker. If we are just biological machines, dancing to the music of our DNA, then choice is just an illusion. We do what our chemistry tells us to do.
But if that's true, and I really want to press on this because it just feels like a logical dead end, if we don't have free will and our brains are just chemical reactions, why are we even having this conversation?
You've just hit on what they call the epiphenomenon paradox.
The what now?
It's a fancy term for a problem that C.S. Lewis and others pointed out. And the source material highlights it. Think about it this way. Evolution is driven by natural selection, right?
Survival of the fittest, yeah.
Correct. So your brain evolved to help you do one thing, survive and reproduce. It did not evolve to tell you the truth about the universe.
Okay, wait. But isn't knowing the truth usually the best way to survive? If I see a tiger, I need to know it's a real tiger.
Not necessarily. A false belief could be just as useful for survival. For example, if you believe that every rustle in the bushes is a soul-stealing demon, you'll run away.
And you'll survive.
If it was the wind, you survived. If it was a tiger, you survived. The truth of your belief didn't matter, only the reaction it produced.
So the argument is, if my brain is just a survival engine, I have no reason to trust my own abstract thoughts about philosophy or logic or even science itself.
Precisely. If thoughts are just the byproduct of atoms banging together for survival, why should we trust them to lead us to any kind of objective truth? Lewis argued that strict materialism cuts off the very branch it's sitting on,
It undermines the very concept of reason.
the logic that atheists claim to value so highly.
And that's the nihilism trap the authors mention. They bring in that Richard Dawkins quote about the universe having blind, pitiless indifference.
It's a poetic line, but yeah, it's bleak.
But here's the pivot point in the deep dive. The authors argue this isn't just, late-night dorm room philosophy. They claim this worldview has a body count.
Now we're moving from the root of the tree to the fruit. And the central thesis here is that when societies actually embrace this idea that we're just animals fighting for survival, no divine oversight, it has historically led to the devaluing of human life.
The text then gives a whole historical survey to back this up. They start with the treatment of indigenous peoples, specifically in Australia.
This is a really dark chapter. The source details how, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many researchers scientifically classified Aboriginal people as missing links.
Not just culturally different, but biologically inferior.
Biologically earlier, the text talks about this horrific trait in body parts. Museums were actually paying for skulls and skins of Aboriginal people to display as evolutionary curiosities, as proof of the transition from ape to man.
And this science then justified the politics.
Oh, directly. It informed the stolen generation policies. The logic, and it's awful, was that half-caste children had some white blood so they could be, saved or civilized, but full-blood Aboriginals were seen as a dying primitive race that should just be allowed to fade away.
They also draw a direct line to the Herero genocide in 1904. And I have to be honest, this was a gap in my own history knowledge.
It's often overshadowed by later events, but it's crucial. This happened in what was then German Southwest Africa. You had General Lothar von Trotha issue an actual extermination order.
Wow.
But the source links this directly to Ernst Haeckel.
The German Darwinist.
Yes. And Haeckel was arguably more influential than Darwin in Germany at that time. He explicitly viewed their hero people as subhuman. The source argues this wasn't just colonial expansion, it was applied biology. They wiped out tens of thousands of people.
And the source is claiming this was basically a precursor to the Holocaust.
They argue the intellectual groundwork was absolutely laid there. But before we even get to the Nazis, the text makes a point to say this wasn't just a German problem, it looks right at the United States and the eugenics movement.
The stats on this were pretty surprising. By 1913, a third of U.S. states had forced sterilization laws on the books.
Correct. And the Supreme Court upheld them. There's that famous case, Buck v. Bell, where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
That's a chilling line to come from a Supreme Court justice.
It is. But if you accept the premise that we're just evolving animals and we breed livestock to be stronger, the logic just follows. Why not prune the human herd?
Yeah, I see the logic.
The source mentions Lynchburg, Virginia, where over 8,000 sterilizations were performed on the so-called unfit, the blind, the poor, the feeble-minded.
So when we get to Hitler, the authors are arguing he didn't invent this idea, he just industrialized it.
Exactly. They contend that Hitler saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as an agent of biology. The Nazi propaganda films, they didn't just say Jews are bad. They depicted the handicapped and the mentally ill as life unworthy of life.
And keeping them alive was framed as what?
As a sin against natural selection.
Sinning against natural selection. That phrase really jumped out at me. It's like they literally swapped out God for biology.
That's exactly the substitution they're describing. And the source shares an anecdote about Stalin that I found really interesting. Apparently, as a 13-year-old seminary student, he read Darwin.
And that was the turning point for him.
According to the text, yes. He reportedly told his friends, God's not unjust, he doesn't actually exist. The authors argued that this removal of the divine, and specifically the removal of a final judgment, paved the way for him to eliminate his political enemies without any guilt.
If there's no judge, the only crime is getting caught.
Precisely.
Now, a skeptic listening to this might say, okay, that's all terrible, but that's the bloody 20th century. We've moved past that. But the source argues we haven't. They connect this worldview to modern school shootings.
This is a really sensitive connection to make. And to be clear, the authors aren't saying evolution teaches kids to shoot people.
That's an important distinction.
It is. What they're saying is that for some specific shooters, they mentioned the Columbine killers and Pekka Erik-Ovanen in Finland, the evolutionary worldview provided the justification for their actions.
I remember the detail about Columbine. One of the shooters wore a natural selection t-shirt.
And Ovanen's manifesto was even more explicit. He called himself a natural selector. He wrote about eliminating the disgraces of the human race.
So the argument is about consistency.
Yes. These young men believed that in nature, the strong dominate the weak. So they thought, why shouldn't they do the same? They felt they were acting consistently with how the world actually works.
It's a twisted application for sure, but the source argues the logic holds up if you first remove the moral absolute that human life is sacred.
Exactly. And that brings us to the bioethics section of the material abortion and euthanasia. The text brings up something called embryonic recapitulation.
Okay, you have to explain that one. I know it involves Haeckel again.
It does.
Okay.
It's the old idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Basically, the theory that a developing fetus goes through its evolutionary stages in the womb. First, it's like a fish, then an amphibian, then a primate, and only then a human.
And Haeckel drew all those diagrams of this, right?
He did, and the source makes a big point that those drawings were proven to be fraudulent a long time ago. Modern embryology completely rejects a literal interpretation of this. But the idea of it stuck around.
How did it stick?
In the legal and cultural mindset. The authors argue that this concept heavily influenced the Roe v. Wade era thinking. The idea that the fetus isn't really a human yet, it's just in a fish stage or a clump of cells stage.
If it's not human, then removing it isn't a moral issue. It depersonalizes it.
Exactly.
Okay, we have to address the major counter-argument here. Anyone listening is going to have a big objection. You can't talk about violence and religion without bringing up the Old Testament.
The moral monster objection. What about God and the Canaanites?
Yes, exactly. If the God of the Bible is the source of all objective morality, how do the authors explain the command to wipe out entire cities? Isn't that genocide?
The source dedicates a pretty big section to this because it is the most common rebuttal. They offer a few layers to their defense. First, they argue context. They state that God waited 400 years for the Canaanite culture's sin to reach a tipping point.
400 years. So the argument is this wasn't some impulsive, angry outburst.
Right, and they focus on why the judgment was passed. The text lists practices like child sacrifice, literally burning children alive to the god Molech as the reason for this judgment. They frame it as a capital punishment for a culture that had become completely toxic.
But didn't they kill everyone?
The source clarifies that the target was the religion and the practice, not necessarily the ethnicity. They use Rahab as their key example.
The prostitute from Jericho.
Right. She was a Canaanite. She turned to the God of Israel, and she and her family were saved. She even became an ancestor of Jesus. So the authors argue it wasn't racial cleansing. It was moral judgment.
And there's also a distinction they make about the scope of the command.
Yes, and this is crucial for their defense. They argue this was a specific command for a specific time and place, a limited commission. It wasn't a standing order for believers to go out and conquer the world, which is how they would classify, say, holy wars.
Speaking of holy wars, what about the Crusades? The Inquisition? Christians have killed plenty of people too.
The authors address this with what I'd call the consistency test. First, they do a numbers comparison. They estimate about 17 million killed in religious conflicts over many centuries versus well over 100 million killed by atheistic regimes in just the 20th century.
But is that just a numbers game? My pile of bodies is smaller than your pile of bodies.
It sounds a bit like that on the surface, but their deeper point is about consistency. They argue that when a Christian commits an atrocity like in the Crusades, they are acting against the direct teachings of their leader.
Jesus taught, love your enemy.
Right, so the Crusader is a hypocrite according to his own worldview.
Whereas,
the authors argue, when an evolutionary regime like the Nazis or the Khmer Rouge kills the weak, they are acting in accordance with their worldview. They are being consistent with the principle of survival of the fittest.
that is a very provocative distinction. One is a failure to follow the rules. The other is the rules in action.
That's the claim they're making.
So, if the materialist tree produces moral relativism and historical violence, What's the solution the authors propose? Is it just be a better person, follow the Christian rules?
Surprisingly, no. The source is very emphatic that religion, if you define it as just a list of rules, isn't the answer. They argue that humans are just incapable of keeping the moral law perfectly.
So if we can't follow the rules, what's left?
Redemption. The text pivots hard to a theological argument here. They call it the Great Exchange.
Okay, explain that concept.
The idea is that the solution to our human capacity for evil isn't trying harder, but having the penalty paid by someone else. They point to Jesus taking the penalty for human rebellion on the cross.
So a religion of do this and live versus a relationship based on it is already done.
That's the distinction they make. And that's what they say fixes the moral anchor problem. It goes back to what they call the logic of love.
Yeah, well, so.
The authors argue that because humans are made in God's image and because they are valued enough to be redeemed, they have intrinsic, non-negotiable worth.
So my neighbor has value, not because he's useful to society, but simply because of who made him.
Exactly. And the source argues this provides the only truly rational basis for human rights. It's the only logical reason to protect the weak, the handicapped, or the elderly people who, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, might be considered a burden on the herd.
It completely reverses the survival of the fittest mindset.
Right. Instead of the strong exploiting the weak, the strong are called to sacrifice for the weak.
We're coming to the end of this deep dive, and looking back, it's so clear the authors just want us to see the connection between the abstract and the actual.
The roots and the fruits. It's the whole theme.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought from the source material that I found genuinely haunting. It's a quote from Adam Sedgwick.
Ah, yes. Darwin's old geology professor. His mentor.
Sedgwick read The Origin of Species, and he wrote a letter back to Darwin. He wasn't just critiquing the science, he was giving him a warning.
He was basically predicting the future.
Sedgwick wrote that if the link between the material world and the moral order is ever broken, humanity would sink into a lower grade of degradation than had ever been recorded in history.
And he wrote that in the 1800s. Before the World Wars. Before the gulags. Before the atomic bomb.
And the authors suggest that the blood-stained 20th century was exactly what Sedgwick feared, the tangible result of severing that moral link.
It really forces you to ask, if you cut the root, how long can the fruit possibly last?
That is the question at the heart of the roots and fruits of morality. Big thanks to Dr. Catchpole and Dr. Harwood for the very challenging material today, and thanks to you for listening.
Keep thinking.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.